The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7 in the Federal Building of Carmel by the Sea. The room was packed with people. Every seat was taken, and more stood along the back wall. They all wanted to see the famous actor, Clint Eastwood, in person. Eastwood sat on the hard wooden witness chair. At 94 years old, he still had that same powerful presence that made him a movie star. His face showed deep lines from years in the California sun, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. He wore a simple gray suit with a blue tie. His hands rested calmly on his knees. Judge Richard Monroe looked down from his bench with growing frustration. He was new to the federal bench, only appointed 8 months ago. At 52, he was known for running a strict courtroom. His black robe seemed too large for his thin frame, but his voice carried authority. "Mr. Eastwood, I'll ask you again," Judge Monroe said, leaning forward. "Did you tell the developers they would face legal problems if they continued with their beach project?" Eastwood looked directly at the judge. "I informed them about the existing laws protecting public access." The judge tapped his pen against his desk. "That's not answering my question, Mr. Eastwood." "It's the truth," Eastwood replied simply. This was the third day of testimony in a case that had the whole town talking. Beach property owners were fighting against a big development company called Coastal Ventures. The company wanted to build luxury homes that would limit public access to Carmel Beach. Eastwood, who had once been the mayor of this small coastal town, supported the local people against the developers. In the front row sat Mary Johnson, who had lived in Carmel for 40 years. She whispered to her husband, Paul, "Clint isn't letting that judge push him around." Paul nodded. "That judge seems to have made up his mind already." District Attorney Frank Miller stood up again. He was representing the state's interest in the cars. Miller was in his early 60s with thinning gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. "Mr. Eastwood, did you or did you not threaten the developers?" Miller asked. "I never threatened anyone," Eastwood said. "I just stated facts about the law." Judge Monroe interrupted. "Mr. Eastwood, you need to give complete answers to these questions." Eastwood raised an eyebrow slightly. "I believe I am, Your Honor." The judge's face began to turn red. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the tension growing. The court reporter, Betty White, typed faster, her fingers flying over her machine. At the back of the courtroom, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun watched carefully. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, had been invited by Eastwood's legal team as a special consultant. She hadn't said anything during the proceedings so far, but she was writing detailed notes on a yellow legal pad. Linda Harrison, Eastwood's main lawyer, stood up. "Your Honor, my client has answered the question directly. The prosecution keeps asking the same thing in different ways." "Sit down, Ms. Harrison," Judge Monroe snapped. "I determine what's appropriate in my courtroom." Harrison sat down, exchanging a worried glance with her assistant, young lawyer Steve Rogers. Rogers whispered, "He's been hostile to our side from the beginning." The questioning continued for another hour. Every time Eastwood answered, the judge seemed to grow more annoyed with his short, direct responses. The famous actor never raised his voice or showed anger. He just answered each question with as few words as possible. During a brief break, people in the courtroom whispered among themselves. Local shop owner Dan Brown told his wife Karen, "I've never seen a judge act this way toward a witness." Karen nodded. "Especially not to Clint Eastwood. Everyone around here respects him." When court resumed, Judge Monroe seemed even more irritated than before. As Eastwood gave another brief answer, the judge suddenly slammed his hand down on the ear. "Bench, that's enough," Judge Monroe shouted. The entire courtroom went silent. "Mr. Eastwood, I find your behavior disrespectful to this court. You have been giving incomplete answers and showing contempt for these proceedings." Eastwood remained calm. "I've answered truthfully, Your Honor." The judge's face was now deep red. "I've warned you repeatedly. This court will not be mocked by celebrity status." Linda Harrison jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, there is absolutely no basis." "Be quiet, counselor." Judge Monroe cut her off. "One more word and you'll be held in contempt as well." The judge adjusted his robe and looked directly at Eastwood. I find you in contempt of court, Mr. Eastwood. You will be taken into custody immediately. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Even District Attorney Miller looked shocked. He stood up quickly. Your Honor, perhaps a fine would be more appropriate given Mr. Eastwood's age and— I've made my decision, Judge Monroe said firmly. He nodded to the 2 court officers standing near the door. Take Mr. Eastwood into custody. The officers looked at each other uncertainly. One of them, Officer John Garcia, moved slowly toward the witness stand. He had grown up watching Eastwood's movies and clearly felt uncomfortable with the order. Eastwood remained seated, his expression unchanged. If he was worried, his face didn't show it. He simply looked at the judge with the same steady gaze that had faced down villains in dozens of films. Linda Harrison was frantically flipping through law books, whispering urgently with Steve Rogers. The courtroom erupted in shocked conversations. Judge Monroe banged his gavel repeatedly. Order. I will have order in this court. From the back of the room, Pam Bondi closed her notebook and stood up. With confident steps, she walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. People turned to watch as she approached the front. Bondi was dressed in a navy blue suit. Her face showed determination as she moved to the front of the courtroom. Officer Garcia had just reached Eastwood's side but paused when he noticed Bondi approaching. Your Honor, Bondi said in a clear, strong voice. I request permission to address the court as a friend of the court on this matter. Judge Monroe looked surprised. And you are? Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, Your Honor. I'm consulting with Mr. Eastwood's legal team. The judge frowned. Ms. Bondi, you are not counsel of record in this case. Nevertheless, Your Honor, Bondi continued, her voice steady, I believe the court is about to make a serious legal error that will not stand up to review. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone watched as Judge Monroe stared at Bondi. For a moment it seemed he might have her removed as well. Then curiosity appeared to win out. You have 2 minutes, Ms. Bondi, he said coldly. Bondi nodded and stepped forward. Thank you, Your Honor. I must respectfully point out that Mr. Eastwood has not committed any actionable contempt under federal law. The record will show he has answered every question truthfully. His answers may be brief, but brevity is not contempt. She pulled a legal reference book from her briefcase. Furthermore, the Supreme Court has consistently held that witnesses have the right to testify in their own manner, provided they are truthful. In Jenkins v. State, the court specifically noted that a witness cannot be held in contempt merely for giving short answers. Judge Monroe's expression darkened. Ms. Bondi, I determine what constitutes contempt in my courtroom. With respect, Your Honor, Bondi continued calmly, ordering the arrest of a 94-year-old man with no criminal record who has voluntarily appeared as a witness would likely result in immediate emergency relief from the appeals court. I've prepared the emergency appeal papers, which can be filed electronically within minutes. She placed a thick folder on the table in front of her. The implied threat was clear to everyone in the room. The judge looked from Bondi to Eastwood, then to the folder. The courtroom remained completely silent, waiting. The silence in the courtroom stretched on as Judge Monroe stared at Pam Bondi. His fingers drummed against the wooden bench. Finally, he spoke. This court will take a 30-minute recess, he announced. He stood up quickly and disappeared through the door behind his bench. As soon as the judge left, the courtroom burst into excited conversation. Officer John Garcia stepped back from Clint Eastwood, looking relieved. Eastwood remained seated, his face showing no emotion. Linda Harrison rushed to Bondi's side. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't expect him to go this far. Bondi nodded. This judge is overstepping his bounds. Let's use this recess to prepare. They moved to a small conference room just outside the courtroom. Eastwood followed them, walking slowly but steadily. His assistant, Sam Peters, brought him a cup of water. Are you okay, Mr. Eastwood? Sam asked with concern. I'm fine, Eastwood replied. Seen worse than an angry judge in my time. In the conference room, Bondi spread out her legal papers on the table. "The judge knows he's on shaky ground now," she explained. "Arresting someone of Mr. Eastwood's age and standing for simply giving brief testimony would not look good on appeal." Linda Harrison nodded. "His behavior has been strange from the start of this case. It's almost like he has something personal against Mr. Eastwood. Or something personal in favor of the developers," added Steve Rogers, the young lawyer. "On their team. I did some research last night. Judge Monroe's brother-in-law works for a law firm that has Coastal Ventures as a client." Bondi looked up sharply. "Are you certain about that?" "Yes," Rogers said. "I can show you the connections." "That could explain his bias," Bondi said. "We should mention this if he continues to act unfairly." While they talked, the hallway outside the courtroom filled with reporters and local residents. News had spread quickly about the judge's attempt to arrest Eastwood. Mary Johnson from the local newspaper tried to interview people coming out of the courtroom. "Can you believe what's happening in there?" she asked Paul Wilson, a fisherman, who had been watching the trial. "Never seen anything like it," Paul answered. "Judge seems to have it in for Clint, but that Bondi woman stood up to him good." Inside the prosecution's meeting room, District Attorney Frank Miller was having a heated phone conversation. "Yes, sir. I understand the political implications," he said to someone on the other end, "but I can't control the judge's actions." His assistant, Lisa Green, looked worried. "This is getting out of hand, Frank," she said when he hung up. "The public will see this as an attack on a beloved figure." Miller removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I know. I just wanted to establish that Eastwood used his influence to block the development. I never expected Monroe to try to jail him." Meanwhile, Judge Monroe sat alone in his chambers. He had made a phone call to someone, speaking in hushed tones. When he finished, he stared out the window at the ocean visible in the distance. The beautiful beaches of Carmel were at the center of this case, beaches that Eastwood and other residents wanted to keep open to the public. The judge's clerk, Emma Davis, knocked on his door. "Your Honor, the 30 minutes are almost up." Judge Monroe nodded. "I'll be right there." When Emma left, he looked at a text message on his phone. "Don't back down. We need this resolved quickly." Back in the courtroom, people returned to their seats. The tension in the air was even stronger than before. Eastwood sat with his legal team now, rather than in the witness chair. Pam Bondi sat beside him, her yellow legal pad filled with notes. Judge Monroe returned to the bench, his face now composed and calm. He adjusted his robe and looked out at the packed courtroom. "After careful consideration," he began, "this court has decided to rescind the contempt order against Mr. Eastwood." A wave of relief swept through the room. Linda Harrison squeezed Eastwood's arm gently, but the judge wasn't finished. "However," he continued, his voice hardening, "I still find the witness's behavior to be uncooperative. Instead of arrest, I am imposing a fine of $5,000 for Mr. Eastwood's failure to fully cooperate with these proceedings." Bondi was on her feet immediately. "Your Honor, we must respectfully object to this fine. There is no legal basis for it. Mr. Eastwood has answered all questions truthfully." Judge Monroe's calm facade began to crack. "Ms. Bondi, you are not counsel of record in this case. You had your moment to speak, and I've made my ruling." Linda Harrison stood up as well. "Your Honor, we join in Ms. Bondi's objection and will appeal any sanctions imposed against our client." The judge's face reddened again. "Your objections are noted. The fine stands." District Attorney Miller watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He finally stood. "Your Honor, in the interest of moving these proceedings forward, perhaps we could continue with other witnesses today and return to Mr. Eastwood's testimony tomorrow." Judge Monroe considered this for a moment, then nodded. "That seems reasonable." The court calls Edward Bennett, CEO of Coastal Ventures. A tall man in an expensive suit made his way to the witness stand. Edward Bennett had a confident smile as he was sworn in. He glanced briefly at Eastwood with barely hidden contempt. During Bennett's testimony, it became clear why Judge Monroe favored the development company. Bennett described the project in glowing terms, talking about jobs and economic benefits. The judge nodded approvingly throughout. And did Mr. Eastwood interfere with your company's legal efforts to develop the property? Miller asked. Bennett smiled. He certainly did. He used his celebrity status to turn the town against us. He even threatened legal action if we proceeded. Linda Harrison objected immediately. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness cannot testify about alleged threats without evidence. Overruled, Judge Monroe said quickly. The witness may continue. As Bennett continued his testimony, Pam Bondi was writing rapidly on her legal pad. She passed a note to Steve Rogers, who nodded and slipped out of the courtroom with his laptop. Eastwood leaned close to Bondi. What are you thinking? He asked, quietly. I'm thinking we need to go over this judge's head, she whispered back. Rogers is researching Judge Monroe's connections to Coastal Ventures right now. If we can prove bias, we can request he be removed from the case. While Bennett testified, Rogers returned and showed Bondi something on his laptop. Her eyes widened, and she quickly wrote another note, passing it to Linda Harrison. Harrison read it and looked shocked. She wrote something back to Bondi, who nodded grimly. Outside the courtroom, local TV reporter Jack Adams was doing a live broadcast. In a stunning development today, Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood narrowly avoided being arrested by federal judge Richard Monroe. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi intervened dramatically, challenging the judge's authority. Sources inside tell us that Bondi may have more surprises in store as this unusual case continues. As the day's session came to a close, Judge Monroe announced, "Court will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. Mr. Eastwood is expected to return to complete his testimony." He looked directly at Eastwood. "And I expect full and complete answers to all questions." Bondi gathered her papers quickly. "We need to meet right away," she told Harrison and Eastwood. "I think we've found something that could change everything about this case." As they left the courtroom, reporters shouted questions at them. Eastwood remained silent, but Bondi paused briefly. "Justice will prevail," she said simply, before following Eastwood to a waiting car. From his bench, Judge Monroe watched them leave, his expression dark. He picked up his phone and made another call. "We may have a problem," he said quietly. The evening after the dramatic court session, Pam Bondi, Linda Harrison, and Steve Rogers gathered in a private room at the Pine Inn, a historic hotel in downtown Carmel. Clint Eastwood sat at the head of the table, listening carefully as the lawyers discussed their findings. "We've uncovered something big," Steve Rogers said, turning his laptop so everyone could see. "Judge Monroe's wife, Helen, owns a significant amount of stock in West Shore Partners." "And why does that matter?" asked Eastwood, his voice low and gravelly. Bondi leaned forward. "Because West Shore Partners is the parent company of Coastal Ventures, the developer trying to build on the beach. The judge has a direct financial interest in the outcome of this case." Linda Harrison shook her head in disbelief. "He should have recused himself immediately. This is a clear conflict of interest." "That explains his behavior toward Mr. Eastwood," Rogers added. "He's not just being difficult, he's actively trying to help the developers win." Eastwood's weathered face remained calm, but his eyes showed his determination. "So what do we do next?" "We file an emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning," Bondi explained. "We'll request that Judge Monroe be removed from the case due to undisclosed conflicts of interest. We should also contact Chief Judge Patricia Stevenson of the Ninth Circuit," Harrison suggested. "She oversees all the federal judges in this region." Bondi nodded. "I know Patricia from law school. I'll give her a call tonight." As they continued planning their strategy, across town Judge Monroe was having dinner with Edward Bennett, the CEO of Coastal Ventures, at an exclusive restaurant. They sat in a private booth in the back. "This is becoming a problem, Richard," Bennett said quietly. "Eastwood was supposed to be discredited, not turned into a martyr. And now this Bondi woman is causing trouble." Judge Monroe sipped his expensive wine. "I didn't expect her to show up. She's very well connected and knows federal law inside and out." "Can you still help us?" Bennett asked directly. "Of course," the judge replied. "I've invested too much in this project to back out now. Tomorrow I'll make sure Eastwood's testimony is limited severely, Without his influence, the other property owners will likely settle. Bennett nodded. Good. Remember, once this development goes through, your investment will triple in value. What they didn't notice was Sam Peters, Eastwood's assistant, sitting at the bar. He had come in for a quiet drink and spotted the judge with Bennett. Now he was recording their conversation on his phone. Early the next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and local residents. News of the judge's attempt to arrest Eastwood had spread nationwide overnight. Television crews set up their equipment while people held signs supporting Eastwood. Save our beaches, read one sign. Eastwood stands for Carmel, said another. Inside the courthouse, Bondi and Harrison arrived early to file their emergency motion. Eastwood came in through a side entrance, avoiding the media. He looked rested and determined. Did you get any sleep, Mr. Eastwood? Harrison asked with concern. Enough, he replied simply. Then he added, when you've made as many movies as I have, you learn to function on little sleep. Just as they were about to enter the courtroom, Sam Peters rushed up to them. Ms. Bondi, Ms. Harrison, you need to hear this. He played the recording he had made the previous night. The lawyers listened with growing amazement. The recording clearly captured Judge Monroe and Bennett discussing their plan to discredit Eastwood and their financial arrangement. This changes everything, Bondi said. This is direct evidence of judicial misconduct. They quickly added the recording to their motion and entered the courtroom. It was already packed with spectators. District Attorney Miller was at his table, looking through papers with his assistant. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Monroe." The judge entered, his face showing no sign of concern. He sat down and looked out at the courtroom. "Be seated," he said. "We will continue with yesterday's proceedings. Mr. Eastwood, please return to the witness stand." Before Eastwood could move, Linda Harrison stood up. "Your Honor, we have filed an emergency motion this morning requesting your immediate recusal from this case due to undisclosed conflicts of interest." Judge Monroe's face darkened. "What is the basis for this motion, Counselor?" Pam Bondi stood up as well. "Your Honor, we have evidence that you and your wife have substantial financial interests in Coastal Ventures through West Shore Partners. This represents a clear conflict of interest that should have been disclosed." The judge's face grew red. "That is a serious accusation, Ms. Bondi. My wife's investments are her own business. Federal law requires judges to disclose any financial interest that could be affected by their rulings," Bondi continued calmly. "Furthermore, we have evidence of your meeting with Edward Bennett last night, where you discussed strategy for this case." A shocked murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Monroe banged his gavel hard. "This is outrageous. I will hold both of you in contempt." Just then, the main doors of the courtroom opened. A tall woman in judicial robes entered, followed by two federal marshals. It was Chief Judge Patricia Stevenson. "That won't be necessary, Judge Monroe," she said in a clear, authoritative voice. The entire courtroom fell silent. Judge Stevenson walked to the front of the courtroom. "I have reviewed the emergency motion filed this morning, including the audio recording submitted as evidence. Pending a full investigation, I am ordering an immediate stay of these proceedings." Judge Monroe stood up, his face now pale. "Chief, Judge Stevenson, this is highly irregular. I was not informed of your visit." "That was intentional, Richard," she replied coolly. "Given the nature of the allegations, I felt it necessary to observe firsthand." She turned to address the courtroom. "In my capacity as Chief Judge of this circuit, I am temporarily removing Judge Monroe from this case while the Judicial Conduct Committee investigates these serious allegations." District Attorney Miller stood up. "Your Honor, what does this mean for the current proceedings?" "The case will be reassigned to another judge," Judge Stevenson explained. "All previous rulings by Judge Monroe, including the fine against Mr. Eastwood, are stayed pending review." Judge Monroe remained standing, his hands gripping the bench tightly. "This is based on hearsay and illegal recordings. That will be determined during the investigation," Judge Stevenson replied firmly. "For now, you are relieved of your duties in this matter. Please step down, Judge Monroe." The marshals moved forward slightly. making it clear they would enforce the order if necessary. After a moment of tense silence, Judge Monroe gathered his papers and walked out through the door behind the bench. Judge Stevenson turned to the crowded courtroom. Court is adjourned until further notice. A new judge will be assigned by tomorrow morning. As people began to file out of the courtroom, reporters rushed to interview Bondi and Eastwood. Bondi raised her hand for quiet. Justice requires that judges be impartial, she said. When that impartiality is compromised, the entire system is at risk. We are grateful that Chief Judge Stevenson acted quickly to address this serious situation. Eastwood stood beside her, his expression calm but satisfied. When a reporter asked how he felt, he answered in his characteristic brief style. The system works when good people make it work. Back in the conference room, Linda Harrison hugged Bondi. That was amazing. How did you get the chief judge here so quickly? Bondi smiled. Sometimes it helps to have friends in high places, but it was really Sam's recording that made the difference. Without that evidence, it would have been much harder to prove the conflict of interest. What happens next? Steve Rogers asked. Now we prepare to present our case to a new judge, Bondi replied. One who hopefully will listen to the facts without bias. Eastwood nodded. The beaches of Carmel belong to everyone. That's worth fighting for. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than before. News of Judge Monroe's removal had spread across the country overnight. National television networks set up their equipment outside, and reporters interviewed local residents about the beach development case. Inside the courthouse, a new sense of hope filled the air. Clint Eastwood arrived early with his legal team. He nodded politely to supporters who called out his name. Pam Bondi walked beside him, carrying her briefcase filled with legal documents. Are you ready for the new judge? Bondi asked him. Born ready, Eastwood replied with a slight smile. Linda Harrison joined them at the entrance. The new judge is Robert Campbell. He's been on the bench for 20 years and has a reputation for fairness. That's all we need, Eastwood said. Just someone who will listen to the facts. They entered the courtroom, which was already packed. District Attorney Frank Miller sat at his table looking troubled. Edward Bennett, the CEO of Coastal Ventures, was nowhere to be seen. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff called out, All rise, for the Honorable Judge Robert Campbell. The new judge entered the courtroom. He was in his late 60s with white hair and a calm, thoughtful face. He sat down and adjusted his glasses. Good morning, he said in a deep, clear voice. Please, be seated. I'm Judge Robert Campbell. I've been assigned to take over this case following the recusal of Judge Monroe. He looked around the courtroom, his gaze resting briefly on Eastwood. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. In my courtroom, everyone is treated with respect and fairness, regardless of their fame or wealth. We will focus on the facts and the law, nothing else. Judge Campbell picked up a folder. I've reviewed the case file overnight. This matter involves a dispute over beach access and development rights in Carmel by the Sea. Is that correct, counselors? Both Linda Harrison and District Attorney Miller stood up and confirmed this was accurate. Very good, the judge continued. I understand Mr. Eastwood's testimony was interrupted yesterday. We will continue with that, but first, are there any matters that need to be addressed? Linda Harrison spoke up. Your Honor, we request that the contempt fine imposed against Mr. Eastwood by Judge Monroe be formally dismissed. Judge Campbell nodded. Given the circumstances of Judge Monroe's recusal, all of his rulings in this case are vacated. That includes any contempt findings or fines. He turned to the clerk. Please make sure the record reflects this. Next, District Attorney Miller stood up. Your Honor, in light of recent developments, the state wishes to review its position in this case. We request a one-day continuance. This caused a stir in the courtroom. Judge Campbell considered the request. Would the defense have any objection to a one-day delay? Linda Harrison conferred briefly with Bondi and Eastwood, then replied, No objection, Your Honor. Very well, Judge Campbell said. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. I expect all parties to be prepared to proceed at that time. As people began to leave the courtroom, a man in a suit rushed in and approached District Attorney Miller. They spoke in hushed tones. Miller's expression changed from surprise to concern. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Eastwood and Bondi. A reporter from a national news network pushed to the front. "Mr. Eastwood, how do you feel about Judge Monroe being removed?" "From the case?" she asked, holding out her microphone. Eastwood responded in his straightforward way. "Justice works best when it's fair. That's all I wanted from the beginning." Another reporter called out, "Ms. Bondi, what made you get involved in this case?" Bondi smiled. "When I heard that one of America's treasures was being treated unfairly in court, I had to help. This case is about more than just Mr. Eastwood. It's about protecting public access to some of the most beautiful beaches in America." Back at the Pine Inn, Eastwood's team gathered to discuss the day's events. Sam Peters rushed in with news. "You won't believe what just happened," he said excitedly. "Edward Bennett has been arrested by the FBI." Everyone looked up in shock. Linda Harrison asked, "On what charges?" "Bribery of a federal official," Sam explained. "Apparently, they've been investigating Coastal Ventures for months. They used our recording as the final piece of evidence they needed." Bondi nodded thoughtfully. "That explains why the district attorney asked for a delay. With Bennett arrested, the state's position in this case just got much weaker." "Do you think they'll drop the case entirely?" Steve Rogers asked. "It's possible," Harrison replied. "Without Bennett pushing from behind the scenes, there's less pressure to fight against the beach access laws." Eastwood sat quietly, listening to the discussion. Finally, he spoke. "Let's not count on anything yet. We still need to be ready to present our case tomorrow." That evening, local residents organized a small gathering at the beach to show support for keeping the area open to the public. Hundreds of people came, bringing food and music. They invited Eastwood to attend. When he arrived with Bondi and his team, the crowd cheered. An older woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for fighting for our beach, Mr. Eastwood," she said. "My grandchildren play here every summer. It would break my heart if they couldn't anymore." Eastwood nodded. "Some places should belong to everyone. This beach is one of them." A local musician played guitar while people sang and enjoyed the sunset. Over the Pacific Ocean, the mood was hopeful but cautious. Everyone knew the legal battle wasn't over yet. Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, Frank Miller was having an emergency meeting with his team. The arrest of Edward Bennett had changed everything. "The state can't be seen as supporting corrupt developers," Miller said to his assistant, Lisa Green. "We need to change our approach." "Are you thinking of dropping the case?" Lisa asked. Miller shook his head. "Not entirely. But we need to find a compromise that protects the public interest while still respecting property rights." Lisa nodded. "I'll draft some options tonight." Early the next morning, before court was set to begin, Miller requested a meeting with Eastwood's legal team. They gathered in a conference room at the courthouse. "I'll get right to the point," Miller said. "In light of recent events, the state is willing to propose a settlement." Bondi leaned forward. "We're listening." Miller laid out a plan. Coastal Ventures will be required to set aside 60% of the beachfront property as permanent public space. They can develop the remaining 40%, but with strict environmental controls and height restrictions. Linda Harrison looked at Eastwood. "What do you think?" Eastwood considered the offer. "Is there any guarantee they won't try to take more later?" "The public portion would be placed in a permanent trust," Miller explained. "It could never be developed." Bondi and Harrison whispered together. Then Bondi said, "We'd need to see the exact terms in writing, but this could be a reasonable compromise." "I'll have the papers drawn up immediately," Miller replied. "We can present it to Judge Campbell this morning." When court convened at 9 a.m., Judge Campbell seemed pleased to hear about the potential settlement. "This is often the best outcome in complex cases," he said. "Both sides get something they value, and the community benefits as well." He reviewed the proposed settlement carefully, asking questions to ensure it truly protected public access while still respecting property rights. "I believe this agreement serves the interests of justice," Judge Campbell finally announced. "The court approves this settlement." The spectators in the courtroom broke into applause. Judge Campbell allowed it for a moment before gently restoring order. Outside the courthouse, Eastwood stood with Bondi as reporters gathered around them. "Mr. Eastwood, are you satisfied with this outcome?" a reporter asked. "The beach stays open to everyone," Eastwood replied. "That's what matters," Bondi added. "This case shows that our justice system works even when it faces challenges. One biased judge couldn't prevent the right outcome when people stood up for what's right." As they walked away from the courthouse, Eastwood said quietly to Bondi, "Thank you for stepping in when you did." Bondi smiled. "Some things are worth fighting for. The rule of law is one of them." 1 month after the dramatic court case ended, the small coastal town of Carmel by the Sea had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, covering the white sand beaches before lifting to reveal the beautiful coastline. Local residents walked their dogs along the shore and children built sandcastles near the water. Clint Eastwood sat on his porch overlooking the ocean, reading the morning newspaper. The front page featured a story about former Judge Richard Monroe. The headline read, "Former federal judge pleads guilty to corruption charges." Sam Peters brought Eastwood a cup of coffee. "More good news today," he said, pointing to the newspaper. Eastwood nodded. "Justice takes time, but it usually arrives." The article explained how Judge Monroe had admitted to accepting bribes from Coastal Ventures and other companies over several years. He had been removed from the bench permanently and now faced prison time. Edward Bennett, the CEO of Coastal Ventures, had also pleaded guilty and was cooperating with authorities to reduce his sentence. The phone rang, and Sam answered it. "It's Pam Bondi," he told Eastwood, handing him the phone. "Good morning, Mr. Eastwood," Bondi said cheerfully. "Have you seen the news?" "Reading it now," Eastwood replied. "Looks like Monroe is finally facing consequences." "Yes, and there's more," Bondi said. "The investigation has uncovered a whole network of corrupt officials who were helping developers bypass environmental laws up and down the California coast. This case opened the floodgates." "That's good to hear," Eastwood said. "Are you still in Washington?" "Yes, but I'm flying to California tomorrow," Bondi replied. "The American Bar Association is giving me an award for ethics in legal practice. They specifically mentioned our case." "Well deserved," Eastwood said. "Will you have time to stop by Carmel?" "Absolutely," Bondi answered. "I wouldn't miss the beach dedication ceremony." After they hung up, Eastwood walked down to the beach where workers were setting up for tomorrow's event. A large wooden sign was being installed at the entrance to the beach. It read, "Carmel Public Beach Trust, preserved forever for public use." Linda Harrison was there, overseeing the preparations. She waved when she saw Eastwood approaching. "Everything's on schedule for tomorrow," she told him. "The governor confirmed he'll attend the ceremony." "Good," Eastwood said simply. He looked out at the ocean, watching the waves roll in. This is what it was all about. Harrison nodded. "By the way, did you hear about the new law the state legislature is considering? They're calling it the Eastwood Act. It would strengthen protections for public beach access throughout California." Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "They didn't ask me about using my name." Harrison laughed. "Would you have said no?" "Probably not," he admitted with a small smile. That evening, most of the town gathered at the local community center for a special town meeting. Mayor Bill Anderson stood at the podium, addressing the packed room. "As you all know, tomorrow we will officially dedicate the new Carmel Public Beach Trust," the mayor announced. "Thanks to the settlement agreement, 60% of our beautiful coastline will remain open to the public forever." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. The mayor continued, "We also have some news about the remaining 40% that Coastal Ventures was allowed to develop." He gestured to a woman sitting in the front row. "Ms. Laura Jones from the California Coastal Conservancy has an announcement." Laura stood up and faced the crowd. "Following the criminal charges against Coastal Ventures, their assets are being liquidated. The Coastal Conservancy has purchased the remaining 40% of the beachfront property. We plan to restore the natural dunes and create a small nature center for education." The room erupted in cheers and applause. People hugged each other, some with tears in their eyes. The entire beach would now be protected. Eastwood sat quietly in the back of the room, watching the celebration. Steve Rogers, the young lawyer who had helped uncover Judge Monroe's corruption, spotted him and came over. "Mr. Eastwood, this wouldn't have happened without you," Rogers said. "You stood up to that judge when most people would have backed down." Eastwood shook his head. "I just answered the questions honestly. It was Pam Bondi who changed everything when she stood up in that courtroom." The next morning dawned clear and beautiful. By 10 o'clock, hundreds of people had gathered on the beach for the dedication ceremony. A small stage had been set up with chairs for the special guests. Eastwood sat between Pam Bondi and the governor of California. Bondi had arrived early that morning and was dressed in a simple blue suit. She looked out at the crowd with satisfaction. "Quite a turnout," she commented to Eastwood. "People care about this place," he replied. "They always have." Mayor Anderson welcomed everyone and introduced the governor, who spoke briefly about the importance of preserving natural spaces for future generations. Then he introduced Pam Bondi. Bondi stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for this. Warm welcome. I'm not from California, but I understand why you fight so hard to protect this beautiful coast. What happened in this town is a perfect example of how our justice system should work. When one part fails, in this case a corrupt judge, other parts step in to restore balance." She looked over at Eastwood. "And sometimes it takes the courage of one person who refuses to be bullied or silenced." Mr. Eastwood didn't just stand up for himself in that courtroom. He stood up for every citizen's right to fair treatment under the law. The crowd applauded loudly. Bondi continued, "The beach we're standing on today will remain open to everyone, children, families, visitors, for generations to come. That's a legacy worth fighting for." After Bondi finished speaking, the mayor invited Eastwood to say a few words. At first, he declined, but the crowd began chanting his name. Finally, he stood up and walked to the microphone. "I'm not much for speeches," he began in his distinctive, gravelly voice. The crowd laughed appreciatively. "This speech has been part of Carmel for longer than any of us have been alive," Eastwood continued. "It should stay that way. Some things aren't for sale. Some things belong to everyone." He paused, looking out at the ocean. "When I was mayor here years ago, I learned that local government matters. What happens in courtrooms matters. Who we choose as judges matters." Eastwood gestured toward Bondi. "And having people like Pam Bondi who know the law and aren't afraid to speak up, that matters too." He ended simply, "Take care of this beach. It's yours now. Make sure it stays that way." After the ceremony, as people enjoyed a community picnic on the beach, a reporter approached Eastwood and Bondi for one final question. "Ms. Bondi, will you be taking on more cases like this one?" the reporter asked. Bondi smiled. "When the rule of law is threatened, I'll always be ready to help. That's a promise." Eastwood looked at the families enjoying the beach, children building sandcastles, older couples walking hand in hand along the shore, dogs chasing frisbees. This was what the fight had been about. "Some things," he said quietly, "are worth protecting." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting golden light across the water, Eastwood and Bondi walked along the shoreline. The beach would remain open to the public forever, a reminder that sometimes justice prevails.